What would you do if you discovered that the very people sworn to protect you were planning something that could cost innocent lives? Would you stay silent to protect your career? Or would you risk everything, even stealing a $150 million fighter jet to do what's right? This is the story of Naomie Jones, a 29-year-old aircraft mechanic who was dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated by everyone around her. But when she uncovered a conspiracy that threatened to turn America's most advanced fighter aircraft into instruments of tragedy, she made a decision that would either save countless lives or destroy her forever. What happened next defied every protocol, shattered military hierarchy, and proved that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn darkness at Langley Air Force Base carried the familiar symphony of military precision, the distant hum of generators, the rhythmic footsteps of security patrols, and the occasional roar of aircraft engines warming up for morning missions. But in Hangar 12, where the Air Force's most advanced F-22 Raptors sat like sleeping predators, only one sound broke the silence: the methodical clicking of precision tools in the hands of Naomie Jones. At 5:30 a.m., while most of the base still slept, Naomie was already 3 hours into her workday. Her petite frame moved with ballet-like precision around the massive stealth fighter, every motion deliberate and calculated. At barely 5'2" and weighing maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, she looked almost comically small next to the 62-foot wingspan of the $150 million aircraft. But appearances, as her colleagues would eventually learn, could be devastatingly deceiving. Naomie's hands, small, calloused, and bearing the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and engine grease, possessed an almost supernatural understanding of aircraft mechanics. She could diagnose engine irregularities by sound alone, detect structural stress that computer diagnostics missed, and troubleshoot complex avionics systems that left senior technicians scratching their heads. Her toolbox, meticulously organized and bearing the wear patterns of constant use, contained instruments that most mechanics couldn't even identify, let alone use effectively. "Jones!" The harsh voice of Master Sergeant Rick Dalton echoed across the hangar floor. "What the hell are you doing here this early again?" Dalton represented everything Naomie had come to expect from her military experience, a career NCO who measured competence by rank and gender rather than actual ability. At 45, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his 20-year service record made him infallible, despite the fact that his technical knowledge had stagnated somewhere around 1995. Pre-flight diagnostics on Raptor 074144. "Sergeant," Naomie replied without looking up from the aircraft's sensor array. The pilot reported intermittent radar anomalies during yesterday's training exercise. "I've identified 3 potential failure points in the APG-77 system." Dalton's expression soured. "Jones, you're a mechanic, not an avionics specialist. Leave the complex stuff to qualified personnel and stick to changing oil and rotating tires." The comment stung not because it was particularly creative, but because Naomie had heard variations of it for the past 4 years. Despite graduating top of her class from Advanced Avionics School, despite holding certifications that most senior technicians lacked, despite consistently solving problems that stumped her supposed superiors, she remained just a mechanic in the eyes of the military hierarchy. "Sergeant, with respect," Naomie said, her voice maintaining professional calm despite her internal frustration. "I've completed over 200 hours of specialized F-22 systems training. The radar anomalies correlate with specific atmospheric conditions that suggest—" "That's enough," Dalton cut her off. "File your report through proper channels and let the real experts handle the analysis." As Dalton strutted away, Naomie returned. to her work with renewed focus. She had learned long ago that arguing with institutional bias was less productive than simply proving it wrong through results. Her diagnostic equipment, some of it personally purchased with her modest enlisted salary, was more advanced than what the Air Force officially provided. Her understanding of F-22 systems had been earned through countless hours of study, often using technical manuals she had to acquire through unofficial channels because her clearance level didn't grant access to certain classified specifications. The irony wasn't lost on her. The military desperately needed her expertise, but refused to acknowledge it officially. F-22 maintenance was notoriously complex, requiring technicians who could think in 3 dimensions while juggling variables that would challenge graduate-level engineers. Yet the bureaucratic structure insisted on treating her like a basic wrench-turner, whose only job was following simple instructions. Captain Sarah Mitchell approached the aircraft as Naomie finished her inspection. Unlike most officers on base, Mitchell had earned her rank through actual competence rather than political maneuvering. A former test pilot with over 1,200 flight hours in the F-22, she understood the aircraft's temperament better than anyone currently flying. "Jones," Mitchell said, her tone carrying genuine respect. "What's your assessment?" Naomie straightened, grateful to finally discuss technical matters with someone who would understand the implications. "Captain, the radar system is functioning within normal parameters, but I've detected subtle timing delays in the signal processing that could indicate early-stage component degradation. The issues won't show up on standard diagnostics for another few weeks, but they're definitely developing." Mitchell nodded, impressed but not surprised by Naomie's analysis. "How confident are you in that assessment?" "Confident enough to stake my career on it," Naomie replied. "The specific pattern suggests thermal stress on the primary processing unit. If I'm right, you'll start seeing complete system failures during high-G maneuvers within 10 to 14 days. And if you're wrong?" Naomie allowed herself a slight smile. "Then I'll personally clean every F-22 on this base with a toothbrush." Mitchell laughed, recognizing the quiet confidence that came from genuine expertise. "I'll make sure your recommendations get proper attention. The Air Force needs more technicians who actually understand these machines." As Captain Mitchell walked away, Naomie felt a rare moment of professional satisfaction. Finally, someone in authority was willing to listen to her technical judgment, rather than dismissing her based on rank and gender. But that satisfaction would prove short-lived, as events began unfolding that would test not just her technical skills, but her moral courage in ways she never imagined. At the morning briefing in conference room Delta 7 buzzed with the usual mixture of routine announcements and administrative tedium. Naomie sat in her customary position in the back row, notebook open, dutifully recording maintenance schedules and protocol updates. As the lowest-ranking person in the room, she was expected to remain invisible unless directly addressed. Colonel James Patterson commanded attention simply by entering the room. A career fighter pilot with political ambitions, he carried himself with the polished confidence of someone destined for Pentagon appointments and congressional hearings. His presentation slides flickered across the wall-mounted screen as he outlined new operational directives that, to most attendees, seemed like routine policy adjustments. "Effective immediately," Patterson announced. "All F-22 squadrons will implement enhanced combat readiness protocols. Maintenance windows will be reduced by 30%, and aircraft turnaround times will be accelerated to meet increased mission demands." Naomie's pen stopped moving as she processed the implications. Reducing maintenance windows on F-22s wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. These aircraft required precise, methodical inspection procedures that couldn't be rushed without compromising safety. The suggestion that turnaround times could be arbitrarily accelerated suggested either profound ignorance of F-22 maintenance requirements or a deliberate disregard for pilot safety. "Sir," Senior Master Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand, voicing concerns that Naomie shared but couldn't express due to her junior rank. "The current maintenance protocols are already optimized for efficiency while maintaining safety standards. Reducing inspection windows could compromise aircraft reliability." Patterson's expression hardened slightly. "Sergeant, the protocols I'm implementing come directly from Pentagon efficiency studies. Our current maintenance practices are unnecessarily conservative and fail to maximize operational readiness." The room fell silent as experienced maintenance personnel exchanged worried glances. Everyone understood that Pentagon efficiency studies were often conducted by analysts who had never actually worked on the aircraft they were optimizing. But questioning direct orders from Pentagon-level authority was career suicide for anyone below field-grade officer rank. Naomie bit her tongue, knowing that speaking up would only result in another humiliating dismissal. But her technical mind was already calculating the mathematical certainty of catastrophic failures if Patterson's protocols were implemented. F-22s were marvels of engineering, but they were also incredibly complex machines operating at the absolute limits of materials science and aerodynamic physics. Every maintenance procedure existed for reasons written in the blood of test pilots and learned through decades of sometimes tragic experience. As the briefing concluded, Naomie lingered in the conference room, ostensibly organizing her notes, but actually trying to process what she had just heard. The new protocols weren't just dangerous, they were guaranteed to cause aircraft failures. The only question was how many pilots would die before the problems became undeniable. That afternoon, alone in Hangar 12 with F-22 Raptor 074144, Naomie made a decision that would change everything. She began conducting her own comprehensive analysis of the aircraft systems, documenting every component, every stress point, every potential failure mode that could result from accelerated maintenance schedules. If Patterson's protocols were implemented, she would need detailed evidence to prove their dangers, evidence that no one else seemed willing or qualified to gather. Working by the glow of her laptop screen and diagnostic equipment, Naomie began building a case that she hoped would never need to be used. But deep in her gut, she knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone realized. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks after Colonel Patterson's briefing, Naomie's worst fears began materializing with mathematical precision. The accelerated maintenance schedules had been implemented across all F-22 squadrons, and the consequences were already becoming apparent to anyone with the technical knowledge to recognize them. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams limped into Hangar 12 with his left arm in a sling and exhaustion written across his face. At 34, Williams was one of the few senior NCOs who treated Naomie with professional respect, largely because he'd witnessed her diagnostic abilities firsthand during several critical repairs that had saved both aircraft and careers. "Jones," he said, settling heavily into a maintenance car chair, "we need to talk, privately." Naomie glanced around the hangar, confirming they were alone except for Airman Rodriguez, working on hydraulics at the far end. She powered down her diagnostic equipment and moved closer to Williams, noting the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. "Marcus, what happened to your arm?" Williams grimaced, unconsciously flexing his injured shoulder. "Raptor 074139 threw me off a maintenance ladder yesterday when the landing gear retracted without warning. Hydraulic system malfunctioned during what should have been a routine inspection." He paused, studying her face carefully. "That's the third random hydraulic failure this week, Jones, on aircraft that passed inspection just days earlier." Naomie felt ice forming in her stomach. Hydraulic failures on F-22s weren't just mechanical problems, they were potential death sentences for pilots. The aircraft's fly-by-wire system depended on hydraulic pressure for basic flight controls. A complete hydraulic failure during flight would turn a $150 million stealth fighter into an uncontrollable missile. Marcus, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that these aren't random failures, Williams replied, lowering his voice further. I've been quietly reviewing maintenance logs from all 3 incidents. Every one of these aircraft was serviced under the new accelerated protocols. Everyone was signed off as mission-ready by technicians who didn't have adequate time to perform thorough inspections. Williams pulled a folded document from his pocket, a computer printout covered with technical specifications and handwritten notes. Look at this hydraulic pressure data from 074139. The system was operating at 97% efficiency when I signed off on it Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, it had dropped to 62% and was losing pressure at an exponential rate. Naomie studied the data, her engineering background allowing her to interpret the technical implications immediately. This degradation pattern isn't consistent with normal wear. Something was compromised during the inspection process itself. Exactly, Williams confirmed. Someone either missed critical maintenance steps or deliberately skipped them to meet the new timeline requirements. Either way, we're sending pilots up in aircraft with hidden failures that won't show up until they're at 30,000 feet pulling. 8 Gs. The magnitude of the problem hit Naomie like a physical blow. If Williams was right, and his analysis appeared mathematically sound, then Patterson's accelerated protocols weren't just dangerous in theory. They were actively creating conditions that would kill pilots in the very near future. How many aircraft are we talking about? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Potentially every F-22 that's been serviced under the new protocols, Williams replied grimly. That's nearly 40 aircraft across 3 squadrons. Jones, we're looking at a potential catastrophe that could dwarf any peacetime military aviation disaster in history. Naomie's mind raced through the implications. 40 F-22s represented not just hundreds of millions of dollars in military hardware, but more importantly, 40 pilots whose lives hung in the balance. These weren't test pilots accepting calculated risks. They were operational pilots who trusted that their aircraft had been properly maintained according to established safety standards. We have to report this, Naomie said. But even as the words left her mouth, she realized the complexity of their situation. Who exactly do we report it to? Patterson implemented these protocols on direct orders from Pentagon efficiency experts. Questioning them means questioning the judgment of people several pay grades above our combined authority. Williams nodded wearily. That's the problem. I've been trying to figure out the proper channels for 3 days. Our immediate chain of command implemented these protocols and won't want to hear that they're defective. Going above their heads requires evidence so compelling that it can't be ignored or buried in bureaucratic procedures. Then we gather that evidence, Naomie said, with quiet determination. We document every failure, every near miss, every indication that these protocols are compromising aircraft safety. We build a case so thorough and well documented that ignoring it becomes impossible. That evening, Naomie found herself in an unprecedented position. Using her personal laptop and accessing technical databases through her official credentials, she began constructing a comprehensive analysis of F-22 maintenance failures since the implementation of Patterson's protocols. The work required skills that went far beyond basic aircraft mechanics statistical analysis, failure mode prediction, systems integration theory, and risk assessment methodologies that most military technicians never encountered. But Naomie wasn't most technicians. Her background included 2 years of aerospace engineering coursework before financial constraints forced her to enlist rather than complete her degree. Her personal library contained technical manuals, engineering textbooks, and research papers that she'd acquired during years of self-directed study. What the military saw as just a mechanic was actually a frustrated engineer whose formal education had been interrupted, but never abandoned. The data that emerged from her analysis was terrifying in its clarity. Since Patterson's protocols were implemented, reportable maintenance incidents had increased by 340%. Minor hydraulic leaks had become major system failures. Electrical anomalies that previously required routine troubleshooting now resulted in complete avionics shutdowns. Most ominously, the time interval between initial symptoms and catastrophic failure was consistently decreasing across all aircraft types. Working through the night, Naomie created detailed technical reports, statistical projections, and failure timeline analyses that painted an undeniable picture. Patterson's accelerated maintenance protocols were systematically compromising F-22 safety systems. If current trends continued, the first catastrophic in-flight failure would occur within 2 to 3 weeks. But as she prepared to finalize her report, Naomie discovered something that transformed her investigation from a safety concern into something far more sinister. Buried in the Pentagon efficiency study that justified Patterson's protocols, she found references to acceptable loss ratios and operational risk tolerances that suggested the dangerous nature of these procedures. Wasn't an oversight, it was a calculated decision. The study, authored by a civilian defense contractor called Meridian Systems Analysis, contained statistical models that explicitly acknowledged increased failure rates under accelerated maintenance schedules. The document included projected pilot casualty figures and cost-benefit analyses that weighed pilot lives against operational efficiency gains. Most chillingly, it recommended implementing the protocols despite known safety risks, arguing that acceptable losses during peacetime training operations were justified by enhanced combat readiness capabilities. Naomie sat in her small apartment staring at the computer screen, trying to process what she had discovered. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence or misguided efficiency efforts. Someone had deliberately implemented protocols that they knew would kill pilots, and they had calculated that those deaths were an acceptable price for whatever operational advantages the accelerated schedules provided. Her hands trembled as she saved the files to an encrypted drive. She now possessed evidence of a conspiracy that reached from Pentagon contractors to base-level commanders. But she also realized that possessing this evidence made her incredibly dangerous to people with the power to destroy her career, or worse. The next morning brought news that confirmed Naomie's worst projections. Captain Jennifer Walsh's F-22 had experienced complete hydraulic failure during a routine training mission over the Atlantic. Only Walsh's exceptional piloting skills and pure luck had allowed her to execute a dead-stick landing at Norfolk Naval Air Station. The aircraft was a total loss, but Walsh had survived with only minor injuries. Master Sergeant Dalton called an emergency briefing to address the isolated incident. As Naomie sat in the familiar conference room, she realized that she was probably the only person present who understood that Walsh's near-death experience wasn't isolated at all. It was the inevitable result of systematic safety compromises that would continue claiming victims until someone found the courage to expose the truth. The question that haunted her as Dalton droned through his damage control presentation was simple but terrifying. How many pilots would die before someone in authority was willing to listen to just a mechanic? The morning after Captain Walsh's crash, Naomie arrived at Hangar 12 to find her workstation stripped bare. Her personal diagnostic equipment, technical manuals, and computer access cards had vanished overnight. Master Sergeant Dalton stood nearby with a satisfied smirk, holding a clipboard thick with official-looking documents. "Jones," he called out with false cheerfulness, "report to Building 247 for reassignment processing. Your specialized maintenance duties have been redistributed." Building 247 housed the base's administrative offices, a bureaucratic wasteland where military careers went to die slowly under mountains of paperwork and meaningless procedures. Naomie had never set foot inside, because competent technicians were too valuable to waste on administrative duties. Until now, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Foster, the base personnel officer, barely looked up from her computer screen as Naomie entered the sterile office. Foster had built her career on rigid adherence to regulations and systematic elimination of anything that might create administrative complications. Personnel problems were solved through transfers, reassignments, and carefully worded efficiency reports that destroyed careers without technically violating any official policies. Staff Sergeant Jones, Foster said, her voice carrying the practiced indifference of someone who specialized in bureaucratic executions. I'm reassigning you to inventory management, effective immediately. You'll be cataloging spare parts and maintaining supply databases. Naomie felt the institutional trap closing around her. Inventory management was where the Air Force sent troublemakers and whistleblowers, a professional exile that would keep her away from aircraft and any opportunity to investigate the ongoing safety crisis. Ma'am, with respect, I believe my technical expertise would be better utilized in aircraft maintenance, especially given recent operational challenges. Foster's expression hardened. Staff Sergeant, your recent performance has raised concerns about your judgment and adherence to established protocols. Several senior NCOs have reported that you've been conducting unauthorized investigations and making unfounded allegations about maintenance procedures. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Naomie realized that her investigation into the safety protocols had been discovered and was now being weaponized against her. Speaking truth to power had transformed her from a valued technician into a liability that needed to be neutralized. Ma'am, the allegations aren't unfounded. I have documented evidence that the current maintenance protocols are creating dangerous conditions that's enough. Foster cut her off sharply. Your new assignment begins immediately. Report to Warehouse Delta 9 for orientation. Dismissed. Walking across the base toward her bureaucratic exile, Naomie passed the flight line where F-22s sat gleaming in the morning sun. Each aircraft represented leaves at risk, pilots who trusted that their planes had been properly maintained according to safety standards rather than efficiency metrics. But apparently, protecting those lives was less important than protecting the institutional hierarchy that had implemented the dangerous protocols. Warehouse Delta 9 turned out to be exactly what Naomie expected: rows of metal shelving containing aircraft parts, supervised by Staff Sergeant Diana Crawford, a career supply specialist who treated inventory management like sacred scripture. Crawford was competent within her limited sphere, but had no understanding of how the parts she cataloged actually functioned within complex aircraft systems. Your job is simple, Crawford explained, handing Naomie a thick manual bound in military green. Covers: count parts, update database entries, and maintain accurate records. No technical analysis, no maintenance recommendations, no contact with flight line personnel, just counting and data entry. The work was mind-numbing by design. For someone with Naomie's technical background, spending 8 hours counting hydraulic fittings and updating computer records felt like intellectual imprisonment. But it also provided something unexpected: access to comprehensive parts usage data across all aircraft on the base. As Naomie mechanically cataloged inventory, she began noticing patterns that told a disturbing story. Hydraulic component replacements had increased by 400% since Patterson's protocols were implemented. Critical avionics parts that typically lasted months were being replaced weekly. Most ominously, emergency replacement orders for flight-critical systems were arriving with increasing frequency, suggesting that aircraft were experiencing near failures. During missions. Working alone in the warehouse, Naomie used her lunch breaks to correlate parts replacement data with maintenance schedules and flight operations. The picture that emerged was even worse than her original analysis had suggested. Not only were aircraft experiencing increased failure rates, but the failures were occurring in critical systems that could cause catastrophic in-flight emergencies. 3 days into her bureaucratic exile, Naomie received an unexpected visitor. Captain Sarah Mitchell entered the warehouse during the afternoon shift change, when Crawford was in meetings and the facility was temporarily unmonitored. Mitchell's expression was grim, and she moved with the careful awareness of someone conducting unofficial business. "Jones," Mitchell said quietly, "we need to talk. Off base tonight." That evening, Naomie met Captain Mitchell at a small diner 15 miles from Langley, far enough from the base to avoid accidental encounters with military personnel. Mitchell had changed from her flight suit into civilian clothes, but her pilot's bearing remained unmistakable. She carried herself with the controlled tension of someone operating under extreme stress. "I know why you were reassigned," Mitchell said without preamble. "Colonel Patterson discovered that you've been investigating the maintenance protocols. He's convinced that you're a security risk who might expose classified operational procedures." Naomie stirred her coffee, choosing her words carefully. "Captain, are operational procedures more important than pilot safety?" "That's exactly the wrong question to ask," Mitchell replied sharply. "Patterson isn't interested in philosophical debates about priorities. He's interested in maintaining operational security and protecting his own career advancement." Mitchell leaned forward, lowering her voice. 3 more pilots experienced critical system failures this week. Minor incidents that didn't make official reports, but problems serious enough that experienced aviators are starting to refuse certain aircraft. Word is spreading through the pilot community that something is seriously wrong with F-22 maintenance. "What kind of failures?" Naomie asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Hydraulic pressure drops during high-G maneuvers. Avionics glitches that cause navigation errors. Engine control anomalies that require manual override to prevent flameouts." Mitchell's voice carried the frustration of someone who's professional. Life depended on equipment that was becoming increasingly unreliable. Yesterday, Major Thompson's radar system completely shut down during a training exercise. He had to navigate back to base using visual references and radio guidance. Each incident Mitchell described matched perfectly with Naomie's technical projections. The accelerated maintenance protocols were creating exactly the cascade failures she had predicted, but her warnings had been buried under bureaucratic damage control rather than addressed through proper engineering analysis. "Captain, I have documentation that proves these failures are predictable consequences of the current protocols. Statistical analysis, failure mode projections, timeline estimates, everything needed to demonstrate that pilot safety is being systematically compromised." Mitchell's expression grew troubled. "Jones, I believe you. But documentary evidence won't matter if no one in authority is willing to examine it. Patterson has convinced his superiors that any criticism of the protocols represents security concerns, rather than legitimate safety issues. Then what do you suggest?" Naomie asked, though she feared the answer. "Keep your head down, do your inventory job, and pray that someone with real authority discovers the problems before pilots start dying," Mitchell replied grimly. "Because right now you're fighting institutional momentum that's bigger than both of us combined." As they left the diner, Mitchell paused in the parking lot. "Jones, there's something else you should know. Meridian Systems Analysis, the contractor that developed Patterson's protocols, they've been awarded a follow-up contract to implement similar procedures across all Air Force fighter squadrons. What's happening at Langley is just the beginning." Driving back to her apartment, Naomie realized that the conspiracy she had uncovered wasn't limited to one base or one aircraft type. If Mitchell was right, the dangerous protocols would soon be implemented throughout the entire Air Force fighter community. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of pilots, all subjected to maintenance procedures that prioritized efficiency over safety. That night, alone in her small apartment, Naomie stared at the encrypted files containing her evidence. She possessed documentation that could save lives and expose a conspiracy that reached from Pentagon contractors to base-level commanders. But she also understood that the institutional forces arrayed against her had the power to destroy her career, her reputation, and potentially her freedom. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether she should act, it was whether she could find a way to act effectively before more pilots paid the ultimate price for other people's ambitions and institutional cowardice. 2 weeks into her warehouse exile, Naomie's worst nightmare materialized at 14:32 hours on a clear Tuesday afternoon. The base emergency sirens began wailing with the distinctive pattern that every military installation dreads: aircraft down, pilot status unknown, search and rescue operations activated immediately. From the warehouse loading dock, Naomie could see emergency vehicles racing toward the flight line, their red and blue lights cutting through the afternoon haze like harbingers of catastrophe. Her heart pounded as she recognized the organized chaos of a major aircraft incident, the kind that transforms routine military operations into desperate rescue missions. Staff Sergeant Crawford burst through the warehouse doors, her face pale with shock. F-22 went down 15 miles southeast of base, she announced breathlessly. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison. Complete hydraulic failure during air combat maneuvering training. Aircraft broke apart during attempted emergency landing. Naomie felt the world tilt sideways. Morrison was 28 years old, married, with twin daughters who had just started kindergarten. She had seen him joking with other pilots in the base cafeteria, talking about coaching his girls' soccer team and planning family vacations. Now he was gone, killed by exactly the systemic failure she had predicted with mathematical precision. The official accident investigation began within hours, led by a team of specialists from Air Force Safety Center who arrived with briefcases full of protocols and predetermined conclusions. Major Lisa Rodriguez, the lead investigator, carried herself with the bureaucratic confidence of someone whose job was to find explanations that protected institutional interests rather than uncovering inconvenient truths. Preliminary findings suggest pilot error compounded by extreme weather conditions, Rodriguez announced during the evening briefing. Lieutenant Commander Morrison may have exceeded aircraft limitations during aggressive maneuvering, resulting in catastrophic system failure. Naomie sat in the back of the briefing room, officially present only because all base personnel were required to attend safety presentations. But she knew Rodriguez's conclusions were lies designed to protect the people responsible for implementing dangerous maintenance protocols. Morrison hadn't exceeded aircraft limitations. He had died because hydraulic systems, compromised by accelerated maintenance schedules, had failed during routine training maneuvers. After the briefing, Naomie approached Rodriguez with careful professionalism. "Ma'am, I have technical documentation that might be relevant to your investigation. Hydraulic failure patterns that could explain the incident." Rodriguez's expression hardened immediately. "Staff Sergeant, accident investigations are conducted by qualified specialists using established procedures. Maintenance personnel provide input through proper channels, not through unsolicited speculation." "Ma'am, this isn't speculation. I have statistical analysis showing increased hydraulic failures across multiple aircraft since." "That's enough," Rodriguez cut her off. "Your concerns have been noted and will be forwarded to appropriate personnel." Watching Rodriguez walk away, Naomie realized that the accident investigation was designed to reach predetermined conclusions, regardless of actual evidence. Morrison's death would be blamed on pilot error. The dangerous maintenance protocols would continue unchanged, and more pilots would die while institutional leaders protected their careers and defense contractors protected their profits. That night, Naomie made a decision that crossed every line of military protocol and personal safety. Using her warehouse computer access, She compiled a comprehensive dossier containing her technical analysis, parts replacement data, failure projections, and documented evidence of the conspiracy behind Patterson's protocols. But instead of routing it through military channels that had already proven corrupted, she prepared to send it directly to congressional oversight. Committees and investigative journalists. The next morning brought another devastating revelation. Captain Sarah Mitchell approached Naomie during her lunch break, her face etched with grief and barely controlled rage. They met behind the base commissary, far from surveillance cameras and curious observers. Morrison wasn't the only one, Mitchell said without preamble. Major Kevin Sullivan went down yesterday at Nellis Air Force Base. Identical hydraulic failure during training operations. And there are reports of 3 more near misses at bases across the country, all involving F-22s, serviced under the accelerated protocols. The scope of the disaster was expanding exactly as Naomie had projected. The dangerous maintenance procedures were being implemented throughout the Air Force fighter community, creating a cascade of predictable failures that would continue killing pilots until someone found the courage to expose the truth. "Captain, I'm preparing to take this evidence public," Naomie said quietly. "Congressional committees, investigative reporters, anyone who might force a real investigation into what's happening." Mitchell's expression grew troubled. "Jones, that's essentially career suicide. Military personnel who leak classified information face court-martial, imprisonment, and permanent destruction of their professional reputation. And pilots face death if I don't act," Naomie replied with quiet determination. Morrison had twin daughters. Sullivan was planning to propose to his girlfriend next month. How many more have to die before someone with authority acknowledges? "What's happening?" Mitchell studied her carefully. "There might be another way. Someone with more authority than either of us. Someone who can't be easily dismissed or reassigned." "Who?" "General Patricia Hammond. She's conducting routine inspections of East Coast fighter squadrons next week. Hammond has a reputation for actual integrity, and she's senior enough that Patterson can't simply ignore her concerns." General Hammond represented a different generation of military leadership officers who had earned their rank through operational competence rather than political maneuvering. Her inspection visits were notorious for uncovering problems that base commanders preferred to keep hidden. If anyone in the Air Force hierarchy might listen to evidence about dangerous maintenance protocols, it would be Hammond. "How do we get her attention?" Naomie asked. "We don't," Mitchell replied grimly. "I do. I request a private meeting during her inspection, present the evidence, and hope she's willing to investigate rather than protect institutional interests." The plan was risky for Mitchell, who would be placing her career in jeopardy by challenging established protocols. But it represented their last hope for working within military channels, before Naomie took the desperate step of going public with classified information. 3 days later, as Naomie mechanically sorted hydraulic fittings in the warehouse, she received news that shattered any remaining faith in institutional solutions. Captain Mitchell had requested her meeting with General Hammond, presented comprehensive evidence about the dangerous maintenance protocols, and documented the connection between accelerated schedules and recent aircraft failures. Hammond's response had been swift and definitive. Mitchell was immediately transferred to a non-flying administrative position. Her flight status was revoked pending psychological evaluation, and her security clearance was suspended for exhibiting paranoid behavior and making unfounded allegations against superior officers. The message was crystal clear. Even general officers were either complicit in the conspiracy or powerless to challenge the institutional forces protecting it. Mitchell's career had been destroyed as a warning to anyone else who might consider speaking truth to power. That evening, alone in her apartment, Naomie stared at the encrypted files containing evidence that could save lives, but would certainly destroy her own future. Every institutional channel had been closed. Every potential ally had been neutralized. and more pilots were dying while the conspiracy continued operating with impunity. She thought about Morrison's twin daughters, who would grow up without their father, about Sullivan's girlfriend, who would never receive the proposal he had been planning, about the pilots currently flying aircraft with compromised systems, trusting that their planes had been properly maintained according to safety standards. Rather than efficiency metrics, the choice was no longer between career success and moral courage. It was between remaining silent while pilots died or taking action that would make her enemies of some of the most powerful people in the military-industrial complex. As Naomie powered up her laptop and began preparing her evidence for public release, she knew that crossing this line would change everything. But she also knew that Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison's death would be meaningless unless someone found the courage to ensure it was the last preventable tragedy caused by institutional cowardice and corporate greed. Tomorrow, she would discover just how far those institutional forces were willing to go to protect their secrets. The pre-dawn darkness of Thursday morning carried an unusual stillness across Langley Air Force Base. Most personnel wouldn't begin their duties for another 2 hours, but Naomie had been awake since 2 a.m., her mind churning through the desperate plan that had crystallized during the sleepless night. Her laptop lay open on the kitchen table, displaying the final draft of her comprehensive evidence package, 127 pages of technical analysis, statistical projections, and documented proof of the conspiracy that had already killed 2 pilots and would claim more victims unless someone acted. But sending the evidence to congressional committees and journalists would take days or weeks to generate action, time that more pilots couldn't afford. Every morning brought new training missions, new opportunities for catastrophic failures, new chances for families to receive the devastating phone calls that would destroy their lives forever. Naomie needed something that would force immediate action, something so dramatic and undeniable that even the most corrupt officials couldn't ignore or suppress it. She needed to make the invisible visible, to transform abstract technical data into concrete reality that would compel institutional change. The answer had come to her at 3:47 a.m., a solution so audacious and dangerous that her rational mind immediately rejected it. But as she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence that no one in authority would examine, rationality seemed less important than the moral imperative to prevent more deaths. F-22 Raptor 074144 sat in Hangar 12, the same aircraft where she had discovered the radar anomalies that first led to her investigation. Due to her reassignment, she was no longer authorized to work on the aircraft, but her access credentials hadn't been updated in the base security system. More importantly, she knew the aircraft systems better than anyone currently assigned to maintain it. Her plan was simultaneously simple and impossibly complex. She would conduct unauthorized pre-flight preparations on 074144, taxi the aircraft to the runway, and broadcast her evidence to air traffic control frequencies across the eastern seaboard. With dozens of commercial and military facilities monitoring those frequencies, her transmission would be recorded and impossible to suppress. The dramatic nature of her action would guarantee media attention, forcing public examination of the evidence that military channels had buried. The technical challenges were staggering. F-22s weren't designed to be operated by maintenance personnel. They required extensive pilot training, physiological conditioning, and detailed knowledge of flight systems that Naomie had never formally studied. But her years of mechanical expertise had given her intimate understanding of aircraft systems, and her unofficial technical library included flight manuals that she had acquired through channels that didn't require official authorization. More critically, she had no intention of actually flying the aircraft. Her plan was to use the F-22 as a broadcasting platform, its advanced communication systems providing the range and clarity needed to transmit her evidence across multiple frequencies simultaneously. Once her transmission was complete, she would shut down the aircraft and surrender to base security. accepting whatever consequences followed. At 4:30 a.m., Naomie left her apartment carrying a backpack containing her laptop, encrypted storage drives, and technical documentation. She had prepared detailed letters to her family explaining her actions, along with instructions for accessing her evidence if something went wrong. The letters were sealed and ready to be mailed, but she hoped they would never be needed. The base was nearly deserted as she walked toward Hangar 12, her footsteps echoing off empty sidewalks. Security patrols followed predictable routes that she had observed during her years of early morning work schedules. The few personnel she encountered were focused on their own duties and paid no attention to a familiar maintenance technician heading toward the flight line. Hangar 12 was dark and silent, the massive F-22s sitting like sleeping predators in the shadowy interior. Naomie used her access card to enter the facility, her heart pounding as she approached 074144. The aircraft that had been her professional focus for years now represented her last hope for preventing more tragedies. Working by flashlight to avoid attracting attention, Naomie began the systematic process of preparing the aircraft for operation. Her mechanical expertise allowed her to bypass several safety interlocks and diagnostic systems that would normally prevent unauthorized activation. Each step required careful attention to technical details that could mean the difference between successful operation and catastrophic failure. As she worked, Naomie's mind kept returning to the pilots whose lives hung in the balance. Somewhere on the base, aviators were sleeping peacefully, trusting that their aircraft had been properly maintained according to established safety standards. They had no idea that institutional corruption was systematically compromising their safety, that each mission represented a roll of dice loaded against their survival. The aircraft systems came online with the familiar symphony of electronic initialization, hydraulic pumps cycling, avionics systems conducting self-diagnostics, and flight computers establishing communication with base navigation systems. Naomie felt a moment of profound satisfaction as her technical knowledge proved adequate to the challenge of activating one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. But as she settled into the pilot's seat and began configuring the communication systems, reality struck with overwhelming force. The cockpit was a maze of switches, displays, and controls that required years of specialized training to operate safely. Her technical understanding of aircraft systems was extensive, but translating that knowledge into actual flight operations was an entirely different challenge. Through the cockpit canopy, she could see the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. The base would begin stirring to life within the hour, and her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. She had to complete her mission before security discovered her unauthorized activities. Naomie activated the aircraft's communication systems and began broadcasting on emergency frequencies used by air traffic control facilities throughout the region. Her transmission was carefully scripted to ensure maximum impact and minimal ambiguity. This is Staff Sergeant Naomie Jones, United States Air Force, broadcasting from F-22 Raptor 074144 at Langley Air Force Base. I am transmitting critical evidence regarding systematic safety violations that have resulted in pilot deaths and will continue claiming lives unless immediate action is taken. She began reading her technical findings, statistical analysis, and documented proof of the conspiracy behind Patterson's protocols. The evidence was complex and detailed, requiring nearly 20 minutes to transmit completely. As she spoke, she could see base security vehicles beginning to converge on Hangar 12, their flashing lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The maintenance protocols currently implemented across Air Force fighter squadrons are guaranteed to cause catastrophic aircraft failures, she continued, her voice steady despite the approaching security forces. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison and Major Kevin Sullivan died because institutional leaders chose efficiency over safety. More pilots will die unless these protocols are immediately suspended and proper investigations conducted. Base security had surrounded the hangar, but they appeared uncertain about how to respond to her unprecedented action. Military protocols didn't include procedures for dealing with maintenance technicians who had commandeered fighter aircraft. To broadcast evidence of institutional corruption. As Naomie concluded her transmission, she became aware of voices outside the aircraft security, personnel and base commanders who had been hastily summoned to deal with the crisis. Through the cockpit windows, she could see Colonel Patterson himself, his face twisted with rage as he shouted orders to the surrounding security forces. "This is Colonel Patterson," his voice crackled through the aircraft's radio system. "Staff. Sergeant Jones, you are in violation of numerous military regulations and federal laws. Shut down the aircraft immediately and surrender yourself to base security." Naomie keyed the microphone one final time. "Colonel Patterson, I have transmitted comprehensive evidence of your conspiracy to implement dangerous maintenance protocols, despite knowing they would kill pilots. The evidence is now in the hands of air traffic control facilities, congressional oversight committees, and investigative journalists. My mission is complete." She began the systematic process of shutting down the aircraft systems, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the extraordinary circumstances. As each system powered down, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had done everything possible to prevent more tragedies, crossing every line of military protocol and personal safety to ensure the truth would be exposed. The cockpit canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Naomie found herself staring down the barrels of a dozen military police weapons. The security forces were taking no chances with someone who had demonstrated the capability to commandeer advanced military aircraft. Hands visible. Exit the aircraft slowly. The commands came from multiple directions, creating a cacophony of authoritative voices that would have been terrifying under normal circumstances. But Naomie felt only exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of having completed her mission. As she climbed down from the aircraft, her wrists were immediately secured with zip-tie restraints. Colonel Patterson approached with barely controlled fury, his political ambitions now threatened by the evidence she had transmitted to dozens of recording facilities. "Staff Sergeant Jones," Patterson said through gritted teeth, "you have committed multiple felonies and acts of treason. Your military career is over, and you will face the full consequences of your actions." "Colonel," Naomie replied with quiet dignity, "my military career was over the moment I discovered your conspiracy and chose to prioritize pilot safety over institutional loyalty. The only question now is whether you'll face the consequences of your actions." As base security escorted her toward the detention facility, Naomie could see the morning sun rising over the flight line where F-22s sat waiting for their next missions. For the first time in months, she felt genuine hope that those missions might be conducted with properly maintained aircraft operated according to actual safety standards, rather than efficiency metrics designed to maximize contractor profits. Her desperate gambit had succeeded in ways that conventional channels never could. The evidence was now public, impossible to suppress or ignore. The institutional forces that had protected the conspiracy would now have to defend their actions under the scrutiny of congressional investigators and public attention. But as the detention facility doors closed behind her, Naomie knew that her personal battle was just beginning. The people she had exposed possessed the resources and influence to destroy her life in ways that extended far beyond military punishment. The courage required to speak truth to power would now have to sustain her through whatever consequences followed. The only question was whether her sacrifice would be enough to prevent more pilots from paying the ultimate price for other people's ambitions and moral cowardice. The fluorescent lights in Conference Room Alpha buzzed with mechanical persistence as General Patricia Hammond reviewed the classified briefing materials that would reshape her understanding of military integrity. At 52, Hammond had survived 3 combat deployments, navigated Pentagon politics, and witnessed institutional failures that would break lesser officers. But nothing in her distinguished career had prepared her for the systematic corruption she was about to uncover. General, her aide, Colonel Marcus Webb, placed a secure tablet on the conference table with unusual gravity. "You need to see this immediately." The transmission that Staff Sergeant Jones broadcast 3 days ago, it's not what Patterson's damage control briefing suggested. Hammond activated the tablet and began reviewing Naomie's evidence with the analytical precision that had made her legendary among subordinates and feared by incompetent superiors. What she discovered in the first 10 minutes of examination made her physically ill. The statistical projections, failure analysis, and timeline correlations weren't the paranoid delusions of a disgruntled enlisted person. They were the methodical work of someone with genuine engineering expertise who had uncovered institutional murder disguised as efficiency optimization. "Jesus Christ," Hammond whispered, a rare breach of her legendary composure. How many people knew about this? Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, based on the evidence, the conspiracy appears to involve multiple levels of command. Defense contractor executives, and Pentagon efficiency specialists. The scope suggests coordination between military leadership and civilian corporations." Hammond continued reading, her anger building with each page of documentation. The Meridian Systems Analysis contract contained explicit acknowledgement that their protocols would increase pilot fatalities, justified through cost-benefit calculations that weighed human lives against operational savings. Most damning were internal communications between Patterson and company executives, discussing acceptable casualty rates and public relations management for anticipated pilot deaths. "Colonel Webb, I want a secure communication link to the Secretary of Defense immediately. This goes straight to the top, no intermediate briefings, no staff coordination. And I want Patterson in my office within the hour under guard, if necessary." What followed was 48 hours of the most intensive investigation Hammond had ever conducted. Working with a small team of trusted personnel who possessed appropriate security clearances, she began systematically verifying every element of Naomie's evidence. The process revealed corruption that extended far beyond maintenance protocols into the fundamental relationship between military leadership and defense contractors. The Meridian Systems Analysis contract was part of a broader Pentagon initiative called Adaptive Readiness Optimization, designed to maximize aircraft availability through reduced maintenance requirements. But buried in the classified annexes were statistical models acknowledging that the optimization would result in increased equipment failures and pilot casualties. The program had been approved despite these projections because the economic benefits were deemed sufficient to justify the human costs. Hammond's investigation revealed that similar protocols were being implemented across multiple aircraft types and military branches. F-35 Lightning II fighters, Navy F/A-18 Super Hornets, and Army Apache helicopters were all subject to accelerated maintenance schedules that prioritized operational availability over crew safety. The scope of the conspiracy encompassed virtually every advanced military aircraft system in the American arsenal. More disturbing were the financial relationships between military leaders and contractor personnel. Patterson's consulting payments from Meridian were part of a systematic pattern of conflicts of interest that created incentives for officers to implement dangerous policies in exchange for post-retirement career opportunities. The revolving door between Pentagon positions and defense contractor executives had evolved into outright corruption that treated military personnel as expendable resources. When Patterson finally appeared in Hammond's office, his confident demeanor had been replaced by the desperate calculations of someone whose world was collapsing. The colonel who had dismissed Naomie's concerns as security threats now faced a general whose reputation for integrity was matched only by her capacity for institutional vengeance. "Colonel Patterson," Hammond began with ominous calm, "I've reviewed The evidence that Staff Sergeant Jones transmitted, along with additional materials obtained through official investigation. Your responses to the following questions will determine whether you face administrative discipline or criminal prosecution. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in military justice applied to institutional corruption. Patterson's attempts to deflect responsibility collapsed under Hammond's methodical examination of documented evidence. His claims of following Pentagon directives were undermined by communications showing his active participation in developing the dangerous protocols. His assertions of ignorance regarding safety risks were destroyed by technical analyses he had personally reviewed and approved. Most devastatingly, Patterson's financial relationship with Meridian Systems Analysis created a clear criminal conflict of interest. The consulting payments he had received while implementing their protocols constituted bribery under federal law, transforming bureaucratic misconduct into felony corruption that could result in decades of imprisonment. General, Patterson's voice cracked as the magnitude of his legal exposure became apparent. I was following directives from Pentagon efficiency specialists. The protocols came from the highest levels of military leadership. Hammond's expression remained ice-cold. Colonel, the protocols may have originated at Pentagon level, but your implementation exceeded their scope and ignored explicit safety warnings. More importantly, your failure to report obvious safety violations violated your oath of office and directly contributed to pilot deaths. As Patterson's interrogation concluded, Hammond faced a decision that would define her career and potentially reshape military accountability. She possessed evidence of systematic corruption that reached from base-level commanders to Pentagon officials and defense contractor executives. But exposing the full scope of the conspiracy would damage institutional credibility and potentially compromise national security programs. Thought the traditional military approach would be to handle the investigation quietly, disciplining the most obvious offenders while protecting institutional reputation through carefully managed damage control. But Hammond understood that this approach had enabled the corruption to flourish, creating conditions where pilot safety was sacrificed for contractor profits and career advancement. Her decision was influenced by a factor that distinguished her from most flag officers: genuine respect for the enlisted personnel who actually maintained and operated military equipment. Hammond had risen through the ranks during an era when competent officers understood that their authority derived from the competence and dedication of subordinates, not from institutional hierarchy alone. Colonel Webb, Hammond instructed her, "Aide, I want a complete investigation of every military installation implementing accelerated maintenance protocols. Full audit of all defense contracts related to efficiency optimization, with particular attention to financial relationships between military personnel and contractor executives. And I want Staff Sergeant Jones released from detention immediately." Webb's expression grew troubled. General, releasing Jones could be interpreted as endorsing her actions. Military discipline requires consequences for violations of protocol, regardless of underlying motivations. Hammond considered the implications carefully. Naomie's actions had violated numerous military regulations and potentially compromised classified information. But those violations had been necessary to expose corruption that was systematically killing pilots while enriching contractors and advancing careers. Colonel, Staff Sergeant Jones committed technical violations of military protocol to prevent ongoing violations of military integrity. Her actions demonstrated the courage and moral clarity that should define military service. I'll accept full responsibility for any consequences. The decision to release Naomie sent shockwaves through military command structures that had expected her to be quietly prosecuted and imprisoned as a warning to other potential whistleblowers. Instead, Hammond's investigation legitimized her evidence and transformed her from a criminal defendant into a whistleblower whose actions had exposed institutional corruption, But Hammond's support came with significant personal cost. Pentagon. Officials who had approved the Adaptive Readiness Optimization Program viewed her investigation as a direct threat to their authority and reputation. Defense contractor executives whose profits depended on accelerated maintenance schedules began political pressure campaigns designed to undermine her credibility and influence. The institutional forces arrayed against Hammond possessed resources and connections that extended far beyond military channels. Meridian Systems Analysis employed former Pentagon officials as lobbyists and maintained relationships with congressional staff members who could influence military appropriations. Their strategy was to portray Hammond's investigation as a politically motivated attack on necessary efficiency improvements. Meanwhile, Naomie's release from detention created its own complications. While she was no longer facing immediate criminal prosecution, her career in the Air Force was effectively over. The institutional trust required for military service had been shattered by her actions, regardless of their moral justification. She faced the prospect of administrative discharge and the challenge of rebuilding her life outside the military structure that had defined her identity for 6 years. The media attention surrounding her case created opportunities and dangers that she was unprepared to navigate. Journalists seeking dramatic stories about military whistleblowing often ignored the technical complexity of her evidence in favor of simplified narratives about individual heroism. Defense contractor public relations specialists worked to discredit her by emphasizing her violations of protocol, while minimizing discussion of the corruption she had exposed. As Hammond's investigation expanded, the true scope of the Adaptive Readiness Optimization Program became apparent. The dangerous maintenance protocols implemented at Langley were being replicated at military installations worldwide, creating systematic risks to aircraft safety that extended far beyond American borders. Allied nations that operated American military aircraft were subjecting their pilots to the same compromised maintenance procedures, multiplying the potential casualties exponentially. The international implications transformed what had begun as a local safety issue into a global crisis of military accountability. NATO allies demanded explanations for protocols that endangered their personnel, while defense contractors scrambled to limit their legal exposure across multiple jurisdictions. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Hammond's investigation was its impact on military culture itself. For decades, institutional loyalty had been prioritized over moral courage, creating conditions where personnel were expected to follow orders without questioning their ethical implications. Naomie's actions and Hammond's support challenged that culture by demonstrating that true military service sometimes required defying institutional authority to protect fundamental values. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and powerful interests remained committed to protecting the systems that had enabled the corruption. But the precedent had been established. Military personnel had both the right and the responsibility to challenge institutional misconduct when lives were at stake. As Naomie walked out of the Langley detention facility on a crisp October morning, she carried with her the knowledge that her desperate gambit had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. The evidence she had transmitted was now being examined by congressional investigators, military prosecutors, and international oversight agencies. The pilots who flew missions today would do so with properly maintained aircraft serviced according to actual safety standards rather than contractor profit margins. The personal cost remained to be calculated, but the moral imperative had been satisfied. No amount of institutional retaliation could diminish the fact that her courage had saved lives and exposed corruption that threatened the fundamental integrity of military service. The reckoning was far from over, but the truth was finally being told. And in a world where institutional power often triumphed over individual conscience, that victory was more precious than any career or personal ambition could ever be. 6 months after her release from detention, Naomie Jones stood in the witness chamber of the Hart Senate Office Building, her hands steady despite the weight of testimony that would determine the fate of military aviation safety for generations to come. The mahogany-paneled room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a congressional hearing that had captured national attention cameras from major networks, journalists scribbling notes, and defense contractor lobbyists whose expensive suits couldn't hide their obvious anxiety. Senator Patricia Williams called the hearing to order with the gravity befitting an investigation that had already resulted in 12 criminal indictments, forced resignations from 3 Pentagon officials, and triggered safety reviews of every military aircraft in the American arsenal. The Armed Services Committee had spent 4 months untangling a web of corruption that extended from small-town defense contractors to the highest levels of military leadership. Staff Sergeant Jones, Senator Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years exposing institutional misconduct. Your actions 6 months ago violated numerous military regulations and potentially compromised classified information. Yet they also prevented what our investigation has determined would have been the largest peacetime aviation disaster in military history. Please explain to this committee why you chose to risk everything to expose these protocols. Naomie had rehearsed this moment countless times, but facing the assembled power of congressional oversight still felt surreal. Her voice remained steady as she began the testimony that would define her legacy and potentially reshape military accountability. Senator Williams, members of the committee, I took unauthorized action because every authorized channel had been corrupted or compromised. One possessed mathematical proof that pilots would die if the accelerated maintenance protocols continued. But institutional leaders were more concerned with protecting their careers than protecting the lives of the people under their command. The hearing room fell silent as Naomie continued, her technical expertise transforming abstract policy discussions into human stories of betrayed trust and institutional failure. She walked the committee through her analysis with the precision of an engineer and the moral clarity of someone who had sacrificed everything for principle. The Meridian Systems Analysis protocols weren't just dangerous, they were designed to be dangerous. She explained, referencing charts that displayed statistical projections with mathematical certainty. Their internal documents explicitly acknowledged increased pilot casualty rates, justified through cost-benefit analyses that valued operational efficiency over human life. This wasn't incompetence or oversight. It was calculated murder disguised as efficiency optimization. The committee's ranking Republican member, Senator James Crawford, represented a district where Meridian Systems Analysis employed over 3,000 workers. His questions carried the defensive tone of someone whose political future depended on protecting defense contractor interests. Staff Sergeant Jones, while we all appreciate your concerns about safety, don't you think your actions set a dangerous precedent? Military discipline requires following orders, even when individual personnel disagree with policy decisions. What's to prevent every enlisted person from stealing aircraft whenever they have complaints about their superiors? Naomie had expected this line of attack and responded with the quiet confidence that had sustained her through months of legal uncertainty. Senator Crawford, military discipline also requires officers to prioritize the welfare of their personnel over their own career advancement. When institutional leaders systematically violate that responsibility, subordinates have a moral obligation to act. Her response triggered a heated exchange between committee members that revealed the political division surrounding military accountability. Progressive senators praised her courage while conservative members worried about the implications for military hierarchy. But the technical evidence was so overwhelming that even the most partisan defenders of institutional authority couldn't ignore the mathematical certainty of her projections. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when General Patricia Hammond testified about her investigation into the scope of corruption. Hammond's reputation for integrity was so unassailable that her support for Naomie carried enormous weight with committee members who might otherwise dismiss enlisted personnel testimony. This committee needs to understand that Staff Sergeant Jones didn't just expose isolated misconduct. Hammond testified with characteristic directness. She uncovered systematic corruption that reached from Pentagon officials to defense contractor executives, encompassing multiple aircraft types and military branches. Without her actions, we would have experienced cascading failures that could have killed hundreds of pilots. Hammond's testimony was supported by evidence that the committee had spent months gathering internal corporate communications, financial records showing conflicts of interest, and technical analyses confirming Naomie's projections. The documentation painted a picture of institutional rot that extended far beyond the F-22 maintenance protocols that had triggered the investigation. Most damaging to the defense contractor position was testimony from Meridian Systems analysis executives themselves. Under oath and facing perjury charges, company officials admitted that their protocols included calculated risks to pilot safety, justified through economic models that treated human casualties as acceptable costs of operational efficiency. Dr. Richard Steinberg, Meridian's chief technical officer, provided the most revealing testimony about the company's internal decision-making process. We understood that accelerated maintenance schedules would increase equipment failure rates, he admitted under aggressive questioning from Senator Williams. But our analysis suggested that the operational benefits justified the additional risks. Dr. Steinberg, Williams pressed, when you say additional risks, you're talking about the increased probability that military pilots would die in preventable accidents, correct? Steinberg's pause before answering spoke volumes about the moral calculations that had driven company policy. Senator, we provided statistical assessments of various operational scenarios. Military leadership made the ultimate decisions about implementation. The attempt to shift responsibility to military officials collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of systematic coordination between Meridian executives and Pentagon personnel. The conspiracy wasn't a case of contractor recommendations being misimplemented by incompetent military leaders. It was a coordinated effort to prioritize profits and efficiency over pilot safety, with full knowledge of the likely consequences. Colonel Patterson's testimony provided the most damning evidence of institutional corruption. Facing federal charges for bribery and conspiracy, Patterson had negotiated a plea agreement that required complete cooperation with congressional investigators. His testimony revealed a culture of corruption that treated pilot safety as a negotiable commodity. I received regular payments from Meridian Systems Analysis throughout the implementation of their protocols, Patterson admitted, his earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate cooperation of someone facing decades in federal prison. The company made it clear that my future career opportunities depended on successful adoption of their efficiency recommendations. Patterson's testimony implicated other military officials who had received similar payments, creating a cascade of investigations that would eventually reach senior Pentagon leadership. The systematic nature of the corruption suggested that individual prosecutions wouldn't be sufficient. Fundamental reforms would be needed to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. As the hearings progressed, public attention focused on the human cost of institutional corruption. Morrison's widow, Jennifer, testified about the impact of losing her husband to preventable equipment failure, her composed testimony carrying emotional weight that statistical projections couldn't convey. My daughters ask me every night when Daddy is coming home, Jennifer Morrison said, her voice breaking despite her obvious effort to maintain composure. How do I explain that he died because people who were supposed to protect him decided that his life was worth less than their profits? Her testimony was followed by Sullivan's parents, who spoke about their son's dedication to military service and his trust that his aircraft would be properly maintained. The family testimonies transformed abstract discussions of maintenance protocols into human stories that even the most cynical committee members couldn't ignore. The hearings also revealed the personal cost that Naomie had paid for her moral courage. Her military career was effectively over, her security clearance permanently revoked, and her prospects for civilian employment complicated by the controversy surrounding her actions. Defense contractor allies had mounted systematic campaigns to discredit her, emphasizing her violations of protocol while minimizing discussion of the corruption she had exposed. But public opinion was increasingly supportive of her actions as the scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Military veterans organizations, aviation safety groups, and whistleblower advocacy organizations had rallied to her defense, arguing that her courage had prevented a catastrophe that would have dwarfed any previous peacetime aviation disaster. Committee's final report, released 3 months after the hearings concluded, recommended sweeping reforms to military procurement processes, mandatory conflict of interest reporting for all personnel involved in contractor relationships, and enhanced protections for military whistleblowers. More importantly, it established legal precedents that would protect future personnel who discovered institutional misconduct. Senator Williams announced the recommendations with the gravity appropriate to reforms that would reshape military culture. This committee finds that Staff Sergeant Jones's actions, while technically violating military regulations, were necessary to prevent systematic violations of military integrity. Her courage exposed corruption that threatened the fundamental relationship between military leadership and the personnel under their command. The reforms wouldn't happen overnight, and powerful interests remained committed to protecting the systems that had enabled the corruption. But the precedent had been established. Military personnel had both the right and the responsibility to challenge institutional misconduct when lives were at stake. As Naomie left the Hart Senate office building after her final day of testimony, she carried with her the knowledge that her desperate gambit had succeeded in ways she never imagined possible. The evidence she had transmitted from the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor had triggered reforms that would protect military aviation safety for generations to come. The personal cost had been severe: her military career destroyed, her financial security compromised, and her future uncertain. But she also knew that somewhere, pilots were flying missions with properly maintained aircraft, trusting that their safety equipment had been serviced according to actual engineering standards, rather than contractor profit margins. Walking through the corridors of power where her testimony had helped expose one of the largest corruption scandals in military history, Naomie reflected on the choice that had changed everything. The question that had haunted her months earlier, whether she should risk everything to save lives, had been answered through actions that would define her legacy forever. The truth had been costly, but it had also been liberating. In a world where institutional power often triumphed over individual conscience, her victory represented hope that moral courage could still prevail against systematic corruption. The price of truth had been everything she had built in her military career, but the value of that truth would be measured in the lives of pilots who would never know how close they had come to becoming casualties of institutional greed. As she walked into an uncertain future, Naomie Jones carried with her the quiet satisfaction of someone who had chosen principle over safety, moral courage over institutional loyalty, and the welfare of others over personal ambition. The reckoning was complete, and the truth had finally triumphed, not because it was easy or comfortable, but because someone had found the courage to make it impossible to ignore. The morning sun cast long shadows across Andrews Air Force Base. As Secretary of Defense Margaret Richardson stepped from her armored vehicle, her expression grim with the weight of decisions that would reshape American military policy. 3 weeks had passed since General Hammond's investigation had exposed the full scope of the adaptive readiness optimization conspiracy, and the political earthquake was still sending shockwaves through the Pentagon's corridors of power. Richardson had built her career on pragmatic leadership and institutional stability. But the evidence compiled by a dismissed maintenance technician had forced her to confront truths that threatened everything she thought she understood about military integrity. The classified briefing folder in her hands contained documentation that would trigger the largest military accountability crisis since the Pentagon Papers. Madam Secretary, General Hammond stood at attention as Richardson entered the secure conference room where defense officials, congressional liaisons, and Justice Department prosecutors had gathered for what would become known as the Andrews Reckoning. The assembled authority represented the highest levels of American military and civilian leadership, all focused on containing damage that had already spread far beyond their control. The room fell silent as Richardson opened the briefing folder and began reading from documents that detailed systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of Pentagon leadership. Her voice remained steady despite the institutional devastation she was describing. Ladies and gentlemen, our investigation has confirmed that the Meridian Systems Analysis protocols were implemented with full knowledge of their likely consequences. Internal Pentagon communications show that efficiency specialists calculated acceptable pilot casualty rates and determined that operational benefits justified increased fatalities. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Even officials who had suspected institutional misconduct were unprepared for evidence of such calculated disregard for military personnel safety. The conspiracy wasn't bureaucratic incompetence or misguided efficiency efforts. It was deliberate policy that treated pilot deaths as acceptable costs of operational optimization. Deputy Defense Secretary Robert Chun, whose career had been built on contractor relationships and efficiency initiatives, shifted uncomfortably as Richardson continued her presentation. Chun had personally approved several components of the Adaptive Readiness Optimization Program, trusting contractor assurances that safety standards would be maintained despite accelerated schedules. Madam Secretary, Chun interrupted, his voice carrying the desperation of someone watching his professional legacy collapse. The protocols were based on extensive analysis by qualified experts. Military leadership relied on contractor expertise to develop optimization procedures that balanced efficiency with safety requirements. Richardson's response was delivered with the cold precision of someone whose patience for institutional excuses had been exhausted. Deputy Secretary Chun, the contractor analysis explicitly acknowledged increased pilot fatalities. The balance you're describing weighted human lives against economic savings and determined that deaths were acceptable costs. She activated the wall-mounted display and began showing internal Meridian communications that revealed the company's actual decision-making process. The documents contain statistical projections of pilot casualties, cost-benefit analyses that assigned monetary values to human lives, and marketing strategies designed to minimize public relations damage from anticipated accidents. Most damning were communications between Meridian executives and Pentagon officials, discussing casualty management and acceptable loss ratios. The correspondence showed that military leaders hadn't been deceived by contractor assurances. They had been active participants in implementing policies they knew would kill pilots. Dr. Steinberg's emails to General Morrison are particularly revealing, Richardson continued, highlighting messages that discussed optimal timing for implementing dangerous protocols. Quote, military aviation accidents are statistically predictable events that can be attributed to pilot error or equipment aging rather than maintenance procedures. Implementation during high-tempo training periods will provide cover for increased incident rates. The systematic nature of the deception was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. Meridian hadn't just provided dangerous protocols, they had developed comprehensive strategies for concealing the consequences through manipulation of accident, investigation procedures, and public information management. General Morrison, whose Pentagon position had made him the military's primary liaison with efficiency contractors, faced the collapse of a 30-year career built on institutional trust and professional competence. His involvement in the conspiracy had been driven not by financial corruption like Patterson's, but by genuine belief that contractor expertise could optimize military operations. General Morrison. Richardson's voice carried the authority of someone delivering institutional judgment. Your communications with Meridian Systems Analysis show active participation in developing protocols you knew would compromise pilot safety. How do you reconcile that participation with your oath to protect the personnel under your command? Morrison's response revealed the institutional mindset that had enabled the conspiracy to flourish despite obvious moral problems. Madam Secretary, military operations always involve calculated risks. Leadership requires making difficult decisions that balance competing priorities, including personnel safety and operational readiness. General, calculated risks are acceptable when they serve legitimate military objectives. The risks you accepted served contractor profit margins and Pentagon efficiency metrics, while providing no operational benefits that justified increased pilot casualties. The hearing continued for 6 hours, systematically exposing the full scope of institutional corruption that had transformed American military aviation into a testing ground for dangerous optimization theories. The evidence revealed that similar protocols were being implemented across multiple services and aircraft types, creating systematic risks that extended far beyond the F-22 incidents that had triggered the investigation. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that international allies operating American military aircraft were being subjected to the same compromised maintenance procedures. NATO partners, Japanese self-defense forces, and Israeli Air Force units were all implementing protocols that Pentagon officials knew would increase equipment failures and pilot casualties. The international implications transformed what had begun as a domestic scandal into a crisis of alliance relationships and defense cooperation. Allied governments demanded explanations for protocols that endangered their personnel, while threatening to suspend joint training operations and reconsider defense procurement relationships. Ambassador Sarah Chun, representing the State Department's perspective on alliance implications, provided sobering analysis of the diplomatic damage already occurring. Madam Secretary, preliminary conversations with NATO defense ministers indicate serious concerns about American reliability as a defense partner. Several allies are questioning whether they can trust American safety certifications for any military equipment. The cascade of consequences extended beyond military aviation into every aspect of American defense relationships. If allies couldn't trust American safety standards for fighter aircraft, how could they rely on American certification procedures for missiles, radar systems, or communication equipment? The institutional corruption that had compromised F-22 maintenance called into question the integrity of the entire American defense industrial complex. Richardson understood that addressing the immediate crisis would require unprecedented transparency and accountability measures that went far beyond traditional damage control procedures. The evidence was too comprehensive and the consequences too severe to be managed through bureaucratic deflection and selective prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced with the gravity appropriate to decisions that would reshape military culture, this administration will implement comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. All efficiency optimization programs will be suspended pending safety review. All contractor relationships involving operational protocols will be audited for conflicts of interest. And all personnel involved in implementing these protocols will face appropriate disciplinary action. The reforms would be painful and expensive, requiring fundamental changes to procurement procedures, contractor oversight, and performance evaluation systems. But the alternative, continued erosion of institutional trust and international credibility, posed existential threats to American military effectiveness that no efficiency savings could justify. Justice Department prosecutors outlined the criminal cases being prepared against military officers and contractor executives who had participated in the conspiracy. The charges would include bribery, conspiracy, negligent homicide, and violations of federal statutes governing defense contractor relationships. If successful, the prosecutions would send dozens of high-ranking officials to federal prison, while forcing defense companies to pay billions in fines and damages. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Andrews reckoning was its impact on the person whose courage had triggered the entire investigation. Richardson concluded her presentation with an announcement that surprised even her closest advisors. "Finally, I'm recommending that Staff Sergeant Naomie Jones receive the Defense Department's highest civilian honor for her extraordinary service to military aviation safety. Her actions prevented what our analysis indicates would have been the worst peacetime aviation disaster in military history." The recommendation was controversial within military leadership circles that preferred internal resolution of institutional problems. But Richardson understood that public recognition of Naomie's courage was essential for establishing new standards of accountability and moral leadership. As the meeting concluded, participants filed out with the sobering knowledge that American military aviation would never be the same. The institutional assumptions that had guided defense policy for decades, trust in contractor expertise, faith in efficiency optimization, confidence in hierarchical decision-making, had been shattered by evidence that efficiency could be deadly. When divorced from moral accountability, the ripple effects would continue expanding for years, influencing everything from congressional defense appropriations to international alliance relationships. But the immediate result was clear. The woman they had dismissed as just a mechanic had forced the most powerful military organization in human history to confront fundamental questions about integrity, accountability, and the true meaning of service to others. Walking across the Andrews tarmac, where fighter aircraft sat gleaming in the afternoon sun, Richardson reflected on the institutional transformation that one person's moral courage had triggered. The planes looked identical to those that had been maintained under dangerous protocols, but she knew that pilots climbing into those cockpits would now fly with equipment serviced according to actual safety standards rather than contractor profit margins. The price of institutional reform would be measured in billions of dollars, thousands of disrupted careers, and fundamental changes to military culture that would take generations to complete. But the alternative price, continued sacrifice of pilot lives to corporate efficiency theories, had proven unacceptable to anyone with genuine understanding of military service. The ripple effect that began with Naomie Jones's desperate transmission would continue spreading, creating waves of change that would reshape not just American military aviation, but the fundamental relationship between institutional power and individual conscience in high-stakes technical environments worldwide. 2 years had passed since Naomie Jones walked out of the Hart Senate office building, her testimony having triggered the most comprehensive military aviation safety reform in American history. The woman who had once been dismissed as just a mechanic now stood before a packed auditorium at MIT, delivering the keynote address to the International Conference on Aviation Ethics and Safety, a gathering that existed only because her actions had forced the global aerospace community to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional accountability. The transformation was remarkable. Where once she had worked in shadows, dismissed by superiors who couldn't see past rank and gender, she now commanded attention from industry leaders, government officials, and academic researchers who recognized her unique combination of technical expertise and moral courage. But the journey from military exile to respected advocate had been neither smooth nor certain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Naomie began, her voice carrying the quiet authority earned through years of fighting institutional corruption. "When I climbed into that F-22 cockpit, I thought I was ending my career to save a few dozen pilots. I had no idea I was beginning a movement that would reshape how we think about safety, accountability, and moral courage in high-stakes technical environments." The audience, a mix of aerospace engineers, military officials, corporate executives, and safety researchers, listened with the focused attention reserved for speakers whose credentials had been earned through extraordinary circumstances. Naomie's story had become legend within aviation circles, but her current work extended far beyond the military corruption she had originally exposed. Following her congressional testimony, Naomie had faced a professional landscape that seemed designed to punish whistleblowers despite official protections. Defense contractors blacklisted her from industry positions. Her security clearance revocation eliminated most aerospace opportunities, and her technical expertise was tainted by controversy that made many employers nervous about association. But the same moral clarity that had driven her desperate gambit also attracted support from unexpected quarters. Dr. Sarah Chun, director of MIT's Laboratory for Aviation Safety Research, had followed the congressional hearings with professional fascination and personal admiration. Chun recognized that Naomie's combination of hands-on technical experience and systems thinking analysis represented exactly the perspective needed to address emerging challenges in aviation safety. "Ms. Jones," Chun had said during their first meeting, "you've demonstrated something that most safety researchers only theorize about: the ability to see systemic risks that others miss, and the courage to act on incomplete information when lives are at stake. We need that perspective in academic research." The offer to join MIT as a research fellow had provided Naomie with intellectual freedom she had never experienced in military service. Her work focused on developing predictive models for institutional safety failures, using statistical analysis and organizational psychology to identify conditions that might lead to catastrophic accidents. The research was groundbreaking, not just for its technical sophistication, but for its integration of human factors that traditional engineering approaches often ignored. Her first major publication, Systemic Safety Failures in High Reliability Organizations, became required reading in aerospace engineering programs worldwide. The paper used her F-22 experience as a case study for how institutional pressures could compromise technical decision-making, but extended the analysis to commercial aviation, nuclear power, and medical device manufacturing. "The pattern is consistent across industries," Naomie explained to the MIT audience, clicking through slides that displayed data from multiple sectors. "When organizational incentives prioritize efficiency or profit over safety margins, technical personnel face impossible choices between career security and professional ethics. The result is predictable: systematic degradation of safety standards until catastrophic failure becomes inevitable." But Naomie's most significant contribution wasn't academic research. It was the practical application of her insights to prevent future disasters. Working with aviation safety organizations worldwide, she had developed protocols for identifying and addressing institutional pressures that might compromise technical judgment. The Jones criteria, as they became known, provided systematic methods for evaluating organizational health and predicting potential safety failures. The protocols had already prevented multiple disasters. At British Airways, her analysis identified maintenance shortcuts that could have led to catastrophic engine failures. In the nuclear industry, her organizational assessment revealed communication breakdowns that might have caused reactor safety system failures. Each successful intervention validated her belief that technical expertise combined with institutional awareness could prevent tragedies, rather than merely investigating them after the fact. Her work had also triggered international reforms that extended far beyond American military aviation. NATO standardized maintenance protocols to prevent the efficiency-driven compromises that had nearly killed dozens of pilots. Commercial aviation authorities implemented enhanced oversight procedures designed to detect contractor relationships that might compromise safety decisions. The ripple effects of her original transmission continued expanding, creating safety improvements she could never have imagined while working alone in Hangar 12. Standing before the MIT audience, Naomie reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had brought her from aircraft maintenance to international recognition as a safety expert. The path had required rebuilding her identity around principles rather than institutional affiliation, finding purpose in protecting people she would never meet rather than advancing within hierarchical structures that valued compliance over competence. The most important lesson I've learned, she continued, is that preventing disasters requires more than technical expertise. It requires organizational courage. Too often, the people with the knowledge to identify problems lack the authority to fix them, while the people with authority to make changes lack the technical understanding to recognize risks. The audience included several former military officers who had followed similar paths from institutional service to independent advocacy. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose career had been destroyed for supporting Naomie's original warnings, now directed aviation safety research for the European Union. Her work focused on developing communication channels that would allow technical personnel to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Master Sergeant Marcus Williams, whose hydraulic-related injuries had provided early evidence of systematic maintenance failures, had become a prominent advocate for enlisted personnel rights. His organization provided legal support and career transition assistance for military whistleblowers, ensuring that future personnel who discovered institutional misconduct would have resources unavailable to earlier generations. The transformation of these careers illustrated a broader cultural shift that Naomie's actions had helped catalyze. The old model of institutional loyalty, follow orders, trust superiors, never question established procedures, was being replaced by professional standards that emphasized individual responsibility for safety and ethics. The change wasn't universal or complete, but the precedent had been established. During the conference's question period, a young Air Force captain asked about the personal cost of challenging institutional authority. The question carried obvious personal significance. The captain was probably facing her own moral dilemma and seeking guidance from someone who had navigated similar challenges. "Captain," Naomie replied with the empathy of someone who remembered the isolation of possessing dangerous knowledge, "the cost of speaking out is always significant and immediate. The cost of remaining silent is often larger but delayed. You have to decide which price you're willing to pay and which consequences you can live with." She paused, considering the complexity of advice that could reshape someone's life. "But I've learned that rebuilding a career around principles rather than institutions creates opportunities that conventional success never provides. The work I do now has impact that extends far beyond anything I could have achieved within traditional military hierarchy." The conference concluded with announcements of new international initiatives inspired by Naomie's research. The Global Aviation Safety Initiative would establish standardized protocols for reporting institutional safety concerns across national boundaries. The Institutional Courage Project would provide resources for technical personnel facing ethical dilemmas in high-stakes environments. Each program represented practical application of lessons learned through her extraordinary journey from maintenance technician to international safety expert. As attendees filed out of the auditorium, several approached Naomie with questions that revealed ongoing struggles within their own organizations. A Boeing engineer concerned about management pressure to accelerate certification procedures. A nuclear plant supervisor worried about budget cuts affecting safety inspections. A military contractor troubled by efficiency demands that might compromise equipment reliability. Each conversation reminded Naomie that her fight against institutional corruption hadn't ended with congressional hearings and military reforms. The fundamental tension between efficiency and safety, profit and principle, remained active across every high-stakes technical environment. Her role had evolved from exposing specific misconduct to helping others recognize and address similar challenges within their own professional contexts. Walking across the MIT campus that evening, Naomie reflected on the path that had brought her from a sterile detention cell to international recognition as a safety expert. The journey had required abandoning everything she had built during her military career: rank, security clearance, institutional identity, financial stability, in exchange for something more valuable but less tangible: the knowledge that her work protected lives rather than advancing bureaucratic interests. The F-22 she had commandeered to broadcast her evidence was now displayed in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, its cockpit preserved exactly as she had left it. After completing her desperate transmission, the placard beneath the aircraft described her actions as demonstrating the highest traditions of military service through moral courage and technical expertise. The institutional recognition she had never received as an active duty technician had finally arrived, though too late to change the trajectory of her military career. But perhaps more meaningful than official recognition was the knowledge that somewhere, pilots were flying missions with properly maintained aircraft, technicians were reporting safety concerns without fear of retaliation, and institutional leaders were making decisions based on engineering principles rather than contractor profit margins. The mathematical certainty that had driven her original investigation pilots would die if someone didn't act had been replaced by equally certain knowledge that her actions had prevented those deaths. Standing beneath the stars that had guided countless aviators before her, Naomie Jones carried with her the quiet satisfaction of someone whose courage had transcended institutional boundaries to create lasting change. The price of truth had been everything she had built within military service, but the value of that truth would be measured in lives protected, disasters prevented, and principles preserved for future generations who would face their own moments of moral choice. The mechanic they had dismissed as just a technician had become something more powerful than any rank or position could provide. A person whose actions had proven that individual conscience, armed with technical competence and moral courage, could still prevail against the most entrenched institutional corruption. Her story would continue, but its most important chapter had already been written in the courage required to choose principle over safety, truth over comfort, and the welfare of others over personal ambition. In a world where institutional power often triumphed over individual conscience, that victory represented hope that would inspire others facing their own impossible choices between loyalty and integrity. The horizon ahead remained uncertain, but it was illuminated by the knowledge that sometimes, when everything else fails, one person with the courage to act can change everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.